The scream came from behind the thin wooden door just as the sun was rising, a raw, broken cry that made the cracked hallway windows tremble and pulled the breath straight out of his lungs. Kareem froze in the narrow corridor of his aging house, his fingers tightening around the chipped mug of cheap coffee as he heard the sound of something heavy collapsing onto the floor, followed by desperate, uneven breathing that sounded too fragile to be real. He had rented the attic room to a stranger only 2 nights ago to keep his electricity from being cut off, and now the air itself felt dangerous, charged with a fear he could almost taste. If you believe in hope, compassion, and second chances, Ripple of Love family, please like, comment, share, and subscribe right now so more hearts can feel this story. Sunlight spilled in tired yellow streaks through the curtainless hallway as Kareem moved toward the door, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight like they might reveal every secret he'd buried inside himself. He was 34 but looked older from years of factory work, night shifts, and a grief that never let him properly sleep. His life had narrowed into a cramped orbit of responsibilities after his wife died from untreated complications of childbirth 3 years earlier, leaving him alone with a 6-year-old daughter and a stack of hospital bills that grew like shadows on the walls. He had turned their small home into a slow, organized survival zone, where every coin was counted twice and every moment of silence felt like a betrayal of the child who depended on him. The girl he had rented the room to called herself Noura. She had stood on his doorstep in the bright afternoon sun, a pale cotton dress hanging loosely around her visibly pregnant belly, her hair messy as though she had been fighting the wind for hours. Her eyes hadn't looked afraid, just exhausted in a way that went far deeper than missed sleep. She offered cash in trembling hands, more than he had expected for that dusty, slanted roof attic room with peeling paint and a single small window that overlooked a rusted fence. Kareem told himself he didn't care where she came from, only that her money would keep the lights on and food in the fridge for his daughter, Samira. Behind the closed attic door, the air smelled different now, sharp with panic and sweat. He knocked once before opening it slowly, the hinges crying as if the house itself was protesting. Inside, the room was flooded with harsh daylight bouncing off leftover dust in the air, turning each floating particle into a tiny, trembling star. Noura lay on the floor near the thin mattress, her hands clutching her swollen belly, her lips colorless, her eyes wide with a fear that looked older than she was. Kareem's hands began to shake. He had seen this look before in hospital corridors, on faces that were about to lose someone they loved forever. A cold memory crossed his mind without asking permission, his wife's nurse running down a long, white hallway, shoes slapping against the floor, while a machine somewhere screamed like a wounded animal. He knelt without thinking, awkward and unsure, grabbing a folded towel and placing it gently under Noura's head, trying to keep his voice calm even though it felt buried under years of silent pain. The day stretched painfully slow, like a film frame held too long. The ceiling fan rattled and moved thick air across the room while the sounds of children playing in distant yards floated through the cracked window. Kareem fetched water, then returned with a plate of dry bread, his mind spinning with questions he didn't have the courage to ask. Noura's breathing eventually steadied, though her shaking fingers betrayed a storm still raging inside her. She avoided his eyes, and he noticed the faint bruises on her wrist, the way her shoulders remained tense as if she expected the world to strike her again at any second. By early afternoon, he had helped her sit up. She stared at the wall, and in her silence he could feel the weight of her story pressing against the room. He had grown used to carrying invisible burdens, but hers felt different, heavier, sharper, and dangerous. He started to notice things. The cash she had given him was crisp, untouched by the usual wrinkles of people who struggled. Her hands were soft, not the hands of someone used to hard labor. A strange silver pendant hung from her neck, tucked carefully beneath the collar of her dress. Outside, the sky was bright and merciless, and the world moved on as if nothing inside this small, cracked house mattered. Kareem's daughter returned from school, dropping her bag near the door, running her fingers along the wall as she peeked curiously toward the attic. Kareem saw the quiet kindness in Samira's eyes when she left a small piece of candy and a glass of water on the last step, just in case the strange woman upstairs was hungry. For the first time in years, Karim felt something warm flicker in his chest that wasn't pain. Days passed under a bright sun that never softened. Each morning smelled of dust, warm metal, and weak tea. Noura began to eat more, to walk slowly around the small house during the daytime when Karim was home. She watched him quietly as he stitched old clothes back together or fixed broken cabinet hinges, her eyes filled with something like disbelief. Meanwhile, Karim's own walls began to crack. Late one afternoon, as sunlight painted the living room in tired gold, he sat on the edge of his bed and silently cried, shoulders shaking, while the sound of a ticking wall clock felt louder than thunder. He cried for how tired he was, for how afraid, for how close he'd come to losing the only home he had left. Then came the day the black cars arrived. They rolled slowly down the narrow street in bright daylight, their windows tinted like secrets, their engines whispering power that didn't belong in that dusty neighborhood. The whole street seemed to hold its breath. Through the window, Karim felt his heart stumble as two men in sharp suits stepped out, their shoes untouched by the dirt of the road. He didn't know why, but a cold understanding took root inside him before they even knocked. Noura saw them too. Her face drained of color as she slowly stepped back, instinctively shielding her belly with both hands. Her breath turned shallow, and her eyes filled with a fear so raw it felt alive. In that moment, Karim finally understood that she hadn't just been a stranger in need. She had been running from something much bigger, something polished and powerful and merciless. The truth revealed itself silently in the way she collapsed against the wall, in the trembling of her shoulders, and in the small, broken object that fell from her pocket onto the floor. It was a tiny, glass-framed photo of a grand estate, wide gardens, and a golden gate. Written in delicate script at the bottom were the words, Estate of Al Safa Holdings. It was a world so far from cracked ceilings and leaking taps that it almost felt unreal. If this story touched your heart, please support it by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Ripple of Love, because your support keeps these stories alive. The men never knocked. They left after a long, slow stare at the house, engines fading back into silence like they had never been there. But what they left behind was worse, the certainty that danger still waited somewhere beyond the sunlight. Now, before the final part of this story, comment and share what you feel in your heart right now. Karim made his choice in the following bright afternoon, when the house smelled of warm soap and sunlight and Samira's laughter floated through the kitchen like music. He packed a small bag without telling anyone, folding old clothes with careful hands, sliding his remaining cash inside Noura's worn purse. He went upstairs and placed it quietly beside her sleeping form, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. For the first time since his wife died, he felt strong, not because he had power, but because he had compassion. In the final daylight, everything felt strangely calm. Noura woke to find him sitting by the window, the city noises humming softly outside. She understood without words that he had chosen to protect her, not because of who she really was, but because of who he was. Beneath the harsh brightness, something beautiful was being born, a fragile, powerful belief that kindness didn't belong only to the rich and safe. Weeks later, the sunlight was softer. The attic window was open, letting in air that smelled of distant rain and street flowers. Papers lay on the small wooden table, documents that carried a new future. Noura, whose real name the world would soon know, had chosen not to return to the estate that tried to cage her. Instead, she chose to stay and rebuild a life away from gold gates and guarded walls. And Karim, the man who had once believed he had nothing left to give, found himself standing in a doorway he never imagined existed, one filled with quiet trust, slow healing, and a second chance at a family he thought he'd lost forever. As the last rays of day wrapped around the small home like a warm blanket, he understood something that no amount of wealth could ever buy. Sometimes the poorest hearts carry the richest love, and sometimes the most broken lives become the strongest shelters. The world outside remained loud and uncertain, but inside that little house, under a ceiling that no longer felt like it might collapse, hope lived quietly, patiently, and powerfully, waiting to grow again with every new sunrise.